Hi, I'm Ben. Welcome back to my channel. It's time again to wrap up the books that I read last month. This time we're talking about July, and I got through 6 books in total, which I'm pretty happy with. Full disclosure though, none of these are from the Booker long list. I had read a few of them in anticipation that they might make it onto the long list, but that announcement took us all by surprise, and so none of these actually made it. I'm a little bit dressed up today in a shirt because we're about to head over to Cardiff for a birthday meal for someone in Matt's family, and actually by the time this is published, I will hopefully have made it safe and sound to Sicily because we're going away for a week. Very excited about that. Not sure yet if I'm gonna vlog that holiday or not, but I'm already agonizing over the books that I'm gonna take. It's a real battle to the death between Booker books and Italian fiction because I do love to read a book or two from the country that I'm going to. I find that always quite immersive, but on the other hand, if I'm going to get through this long list, maybe I do need to prioritise some of those Booker books. Anyway, let's jump into the books that I read in July. The first book I read was Chain Gang All Stars by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah. This is technically a debut, although Adjei-Brenyah has previously released a short story collection called Friday Black, which I really enjoyed. These stories are really hard-hitting and engaging and inventive, and if you are a short story fan, I would definitely recommend it. This, though, is his debut novel, and it's a near-future dystopia where prisoners are offered the chance to win their freedom by competing in the Chain Gang All-Stars. They're a series of televised battles to the death that take place in stadia around the US. If you survive long enough and you win enough battles, you get to leave the prison system and return to the outside world. The main story here focuses on a core group of links, which is the name given to the prisoners who are competing in the Chain Gang All-Stars. We're following Loretta Thurwar and Hurricane Stacks, 2 women of colour who are formidable fighters and also romantically involved. We also get snippets of spectators, of protesters, the people running the organisation, and a few secondary links on what led them into the system. There are lots of characters, and some are better drawn than others, but luckily the most fully rounded ones are the central characters that we're following throughout the story. I loved how these different characters were introduced and how their plots came together. There are 2 storylines in particular where it's not really clear what their purpose is or where they're going, but they end up really coming into the main plot in quite a horrifying and heartbreaking way, and I thought that was very well done. I wouldn't say the writing was particularly beautiful, but then I don't think it was intended to be. This is a very plot-driven book, but it definitely had some really nice turns of phrase. There was one description where it was talking about how a man went into the prison system and things just got worse for him as a result of being in it. And Adjei-Brenyah says, because he was ruined, he ruined, and then was ruined some more. And I really liked that. I thought it was quite an effective, poetic description. And actually, there are moments in this book that read a little bit like beat poetry. They have the same sort of rhythm. There's also a non-trivial whiff of George Saunders about this. Brand names, the metaphors, just the writing in general. And if you are a Saunders fan, I think you'll have a really good time with this. There are footnotes littered throughout the book, and they are commenting on the events of the story, but also bringing in real life injustices that we will find familiar, names that we will recognise. And these footnotes serve as a really interesting sort of meta text to go along with the main story. They get more and more angry as the story progresses. And I found it a really interesting way to have Adjei-Brenyah's own thoughts and feelings piercing the narrative as we move through the story. I've seen a few people mention that this is a bit on the nose, and it is. It's very clearly railing against the prison system in the US, particularly its operation for profit and its disproportionate penalisation of people of colour. Adjei-Brenyah is angry about this and he doesn't hide it. But I think it is also much more than that. I think this novel very, very cleverly joins the dots in what can be painted as a bit of an inconsistency. While many black Americans are incarcerated, they also feature really prominently in entertainment and sports. And that might make you think, well, maybe people of colour are equal because we sing their songs and we cheer for them on the sports field. But by combining the incarceration and sports entertainment into a single role in this novel, Adjei-Brenyah completely demolishes the argument that adoration for black athletes by itself represents equality. Spectators in this novel scream for these characters, but they also fetishize them and they have bloodlust for them and they speak about them like objects. They wear Loretta Thurwar t-shirts and hats while also being drawn into watching black bodies harmed on their TV screens. It really made me think of the awful voyeuristic footage of police brutality against people of colour that is depressingly common in the news. So while the prison parallel is pretty straightforward, it is pretty blatant, these echoes of other themes made this feel like a really smart novel. Overall, I thought it was a really successful read for me. I was enthralled by the all too realistic world that Adjei-Brenyah puts down on the page, and I was really invested in the characters. The ending just got me. I loved the ride. And thank you to Harville Secker and Vintage for giving me an advance copy of this. Really appreciate it. Next, I read August Blue by Deborah Levy. I borrowed this one from my library and I'd not read any Deborah Levy before, so this was my first experience. This is about a classical pianist called Elsa. Her real name was Anna though, and she was made to change it when she was adopted by this famous piano teacher named Arthur. She has a kind of weird relationship with him. I don't think it's like abusive particularly, and there's love there for sure, but it is weird and it's not a normal father-daughter relationship. For one, the whole name change thing is odd, and if you're thinking, Anna and Elsa, where do I know those names from? It's Disney's Frozen, which a lot of people are assuming is purposeful on the part of Levy because Elsa also dyes her hair blue and Elsa's dress in Frozen is blue or something like that. Anyway, Elsa was a child prodigy and she's grown into this piano virtuoso as an adult. But when we meet her, she's in her 30s and she's recently made a very public balls up of performing some Rachmaninoff in Vienna. As a result, she is out of the classical music scene and she ends up bouncing around all these European cities tutoring the children of rich people. What's driving this plot though is Elsa's fascination with her double, who she spots at the very start of the book buying some models of horses at a market in Athens. Her double drops a hat that Elsa then wears throughout most of the rest of the book, and then strange encounters seem to happen between Elsa and her double in different places. I believe the double is quite a common thing in literature, but to be honest, I'm not too familiar with it, so I think a lot of that went over my head. I definitely enjoyed the classical music aspect of this, and I do think it's a weirdly enthralling subject matter in literature. If I think about something like Kazuo Ishiguro's Nocturnes, that's focused a lot on musicians, or some of Richard Powers' books that I haven't read, but I really want to. They really interest me. And then obviously the film Tar from last year was absolutely amazing. But yeah, I just loved hearing the descriptions and the discussions about classical music. I particularly enjoyed the scenes with her tutoring, and I liked the way that the kids' attitudes towards music was a bit of a stand-in for their general situation. For instance, the first child that Elsa tutors is being pushed to learn piano because that's the done thing according to their father, but actually they want to play the cello and they want to dance. And this reflects the kids' use of they-them pronouns, which the father either doesn't know about or doesn't really respect because he continues to call the child my son. And I thought that was all quite clever how that tied in. The language is very spare. I found it quite hypnotic. I have a feeling there are many more symbols and metaphors and stuff that I didn't pick up. But because of its readability, I do think you could read this at many different levels, and you'd probably get a lot out of a repeat read if that's the sort of thing you like to do. This does sound like a pretty positive review overall, and I did like it, but I can't really say that I loved this book. It was very ponderous, and I didn't feel particularly gripped. Overall, I had a pleasant time with it, but I'm not massively excited. The third book I read this month was When We Cease to Understand the World by Benjamín Labatut, translated from the original Spanish by Adrian Nathan West, whose name should be on the cover. Labatut is a Chilean author, and this book was shortlisted for the International Booker Prize a few years ago. I know that it's got some real big fans who would have loved to have seen it win. This has actually got a bookmark in it because Matt's reading it at the moment because he finds this subject matter really interesting too. This is a book that blends fact and fiction, telling the stories of a number of real scientists who made discoveries and how they affected the world. Often how these discoveries were used both to help people but also to harm them in times of war and atrocity. I think a lot of the arcs of these characters are true, but Labatut fills in the gaps and creates these invented scenes. I enjoyed the writing a lot. It had that sparkle that really good narrative non-fiction does, just finding these incredible, interesting little historical tidbits and using that as an entry point to tell a bigger historical story. As an example, the story opens with this story about Hermann Goering, who was a high-ranking Nazi official, and having his fingers turn this really vibrant red colour because he had a dependency on this heroin-like drug called dihydrocodeine. It just pulls you in completely because I hadn't heard this anecdote before, and it was a strange little story that then took me on a journey through cyanide and Zyklon A, its connection to this sought-after shade of blue paint, and so on, connecting the dots between all these scientists. It really captured the beauty and beastliness that can come out of these discoveries and developments. And the echoes of these connections pop up again and again throughout the book. Like a gas might be discovered on one page and then 10 pages later it's encountered on the battlefield by another scientist because it's been deployed in war, and then that scientist goes on to make some other discovery, and so on. It's this chain reaction that's really interesting. The construction of the book is almost like short stories. We get one focusing on Fritz Haber, who developed a process to create synthesized ammonia, which is important for explosions which kill people, but also fertilizers which fed millions and millions of people and avoided starvation. But then also stories about Werner Heisenberg, Schrödinger, Albert Einstein. I think my favourite though was this chapter on a Japanese mathematician called Shinichi Mochizuki. He created a whole new branch of mathematics to prove this long-standing mathematical assumption, but nobody could understand it. I found it such a fascinating look into this idea of beauty and elegance in mathematics, how the scientific community works, and how mathematics can be perceived as being this danger to humanity because it unlocks too much power. If you've been slightly put off by how much sciencey gubbins I've been talking about here, I don't think you need to worry about reading this book. You don't need to be familiar with science to enjoy it, but you should feel open to it or like slightly interested in the story or history of science. Labatut definitely doesn't go too much into the scientific detail, but he gives you just enough, and I think he explains it in an engaging enough way that you can just go along for the ride. I think I read this at the perfect time, as I finished it a few days before seeing the new Oppenheimer film, which does a similar sort of thing, obviously in a different medium, but centered around the life of J. Robert Oppenheimer, who worked on the first atomic bomb. Oppenheimer is mentioned in passing here, he's not a central character, and some of the characters in this book do appear in the film. There were even a few quotes that appear in both, such as Einstein's assertion that God doesn't play dice when he was rebutting some stuff about quantum physics that he didn't like. It feels like a really wonderful companion piece for the film, as it covers similar territory but with very minimal overlap. Overall, really loved this one, thought it was brilliant, and I can't wait for his new book, The Maniac, coming out later this year. Next, I read Corey Farr Does Social Mobility by Isabel Waidner. Waidner is a German-British author who writes quite experimental fiction and has been quite successful in some of the smaller prizes, like the Republic of Consciousness Prize and the Goldsmiths Prize. This is their first novel published by a bigger publishing house, and it was quite heavily tipped for the Booker Prize but didn't make it in the end. This book is about a character called Corey Farr, who is an author who's from a background outside of the usual literati, and so when they win a prestigious literature award, they just don't know how to collect it. It's very surreal, very weird, often very funny in the moment-to-moment action, but to be totally honest, I think I just didn't get it. I'm not sure this is really a book for me. There is a very odd cast of characters, one of whom is Bambi, like actual Disney Bambi, except with 4 extra spider's legs attached to their body and extra eyes. There's Thumper, with a F instead of a TH, and a time-travelling TV presenter who is trying to find evidence of wormholes like the one he fell through in the 1980s, just after he'd won the same prize that Corey Farr had won in the today of the novel. I feel like there's a lot to decode here, but as much as I scratch at the surface of the novel, I really can't do much better or find anything deeper than publishing is elite and it chews up young authors from outside the scene and spits them out. I have genuinely no idea what the Disney stuff was about, so if someone does know, I'd love you to explain that to me in the comments. Overall, it just made for a kind of amusing but ultimately unsatisfying read for me, and I very much feel like that's a deficiency in me as a reader rather than Waidner's writing, because I can see the craft, I just can't understand it. If you are into experimental, surreal, crazy fiction, then I think you would enjoy this a lot. It would be quite a ride. So maybe give it a flip through in a bookshop or a library and see how you feel about the first few pages. If you do like what you see, then you'll probably enjoy the ride. Okay, next is another pretty hyped book, which is Eliza Clarke's Penance. This is her second novel after her cracking debut, Boy Parts. This one is quite different. It's a fake true crime story about the murder of a schoolgirl named Joni Wilson, and it's set in a fictional seaside town called Crow-on-Sea, which is a kind of poorer, more run-down neighbour of nearby Whitby and Scarborough. The book opens with some fake front matter from the fake publisher, alluding to this being a reprint or a reissue of a book whose facts are contested by some of the people featured in it. So immediately we're in unreliable narrator territory. What then follows is a very enjoyable but actually not too twisty true crime story. The events of the murder are introduced, and then we work through 4 girls who are involved, who start out being called Girl A, Girl B, Girl C and Girl D, and then they get names. And their stories are told with slightly different source material as the backbone for each chapter. So Girl A's story involves some correspondence, Girl D is interviewed, Girl C's Tumblr posts are used, and so on. We learn new things each chapter, and it slightly reframes our view of the girls we've been introduced to so far, but not in any mind-blowing way. On the unreliable narrator front, there are definitely some weird things this author does. And by author, I mean like the fake author of the book, who's called Alec Corelli. His behaviour and the fact that he describes and includes it in the book is kind of odd, and he also includes chapters where he has dramatised and fictionalised the events in the run-up to the murder, so he's written chapters that are a bit more like a novel. I found this book so much fun to read. Clarke really has her finger on the pulse of the true crime scene and includes like these fake transcripts of cringy and insensitive podcasts, but also she knows a lot about 2010s popular culture when these girls were at school. I'm like probably a decade older than the characters in this, but I could recognise a lot of the references and behaviours, and I just found it wildly entertaining. There was a particular run of about 20 pages towards the end where the dialogue was just cracking me up the whole time. I was expecting a big denouement, where everything was revealed and things went as we thought, but I think it's worth noting that there isn't one. You don't get the rug pulled from under you. At first I found that slightly disappointing, but the more I think about it, the more satisfied I feel. I think Eliza Clarke is making some really interesting observations about the true crime genre in general. There's like an epigraph that's a quote from Truman Capote, who is one of the most famous true crime writers, and it's also an interesting, not critique, but thought provoker when it comes to narrative non-fiction. This really had me reflecting on things like Patrick Radden Keefe's Empire of Pain, which although is incredibly well researched because he's got an enormous bibliography at the back, it still leans into this spinning of a yarn. It doesn't make me think any less fondly of Empire of Pain, which is a fantastic book, but it is fascinating to think about the authorial choices and the ethics of those choices. Clarke's characters and the sense of place in this book, this story in general, it felt so convincing and so real that it is a facsimile for a true crime story that someone could have written, and that is really interesting to me. It's definitely worth thinking about this book in comparison to her debut. This is a very, very different novel to Boy Parts, and I do think the distinctiveness of the voice in that book is a little bit lost, but that comes with part and parcel of stepping into the shoes of this fake journalist. But at the same time, it's definitely a more polished, more confident novel. I love that she has put something out there that's completely different, and I'm excited to see what she does next. Thank you to Faber for sending me this finished copy. I really enjoyed it. The final book I read this month was another one I pinched from my library, and this was Small Worlds by Caleb Azumah Nelson. I actually had to speed read this quite a lot because I had about 100 pages to go and about 2 hours before the library shut on the day it was due back. So I ended up going and just sitting in the library and racing against the clock, and I did make it. Actually, I had to take photographs of like the last 2 pages and read them on my phone when I left the library. Anyway, this is about a young man called Stephen, who's the child of Ghanaian immigrants, and he's growing up in London. We first meet him when he's at school, and he spends his time dancing, hanging out with his friends, doing jam sessions where he plays the trumpet, and he has ambitions to go to music college with his female friend called Del, with whom he shares a pretty special, deep connection. I won't spoil the plot too much, but it definitely echoes Open Water with a bit of a will they, won't they dynamic between Stephen and Del. What's more prominent here, though, that isn't so much in Open Water is the protagonist's family and his relationships with his brother Raymond, his mother, and maybe most significantly, his father. I really enjoyed reading about these characters, learning along with Stephen about their experiences and the echoes of their lives in Stephen's. If you've read Open Water, you'll know that it had a really interesting style in that it was written in the second person, making you the protagonist. Without spoiling too much, the second person narration does make an appearance at one point in this novel, and I think the way that it's deployed here is way more impactful than it is in Open Water. I really loved what Azumah Nelson did with it. Just like Open Water, the language is very poetic. There are repeated refrains and images. The small worlds of the title are mentioned again and again. The small world of the family unit, of a moment between two people, of walking down the street with headphones cocooned in your music. The phrase small world is perhaps said a little bit too often, and there is a dodgy image here and there. There's like this repeated one of the way the light grabs someone's neck, which I couldn't really get my head around. But on the whole, I think the language is more successful than it isn't, and there were many beautiful turns of phrase. And actually a lot of these phrases that Stephen uses in the book do kind of come to fruition in quite a satisfying way at the end, which I can't really explain without spoiling, but it worked really well for me. The musical references are also still here in droves, maybe more so than in Open Water. And this time around, for whatever reason, I found them much more familiar and accessible. I knew the names of the artists and some of the songs a lot more, but that might be just like luck of the draw. If I'm honest, I really wasn't that sure about Open Water. I didn't get it as much as a lot of other readers seem to, and I thought it sagged under the weight of its writing a little. But I enjoyed this book so much more. I think the characters were just so much better developed. I think the writing was more refined, and I think Azumah Nelson really knocked it out of the park with this one. It was a really cracking read. Those are the 6 books that I read this month. I'd love to hear in the comments if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them, but also what your favourite reads of July were. Please do let me know. If you enjoyed watching this video, please do give it a like. It really helps me out. And if you are new to the channel and you've not yet subscribed, then hit the subscribe button and you'll get a new video from me every week landing in your subscriptions feed. I'll be back with more, I guess, very heavily booker focused content in the coming weeks and months. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, toodles.